Okay, it's clear to me that I need to sort of play backup for you guys on these presentations. So my goal here, you can see it's 5:23 in the morning. I have to be on the MRT at 6 o'clock. So I'm going to try to force myself to limit this overview of the Indian under imperialism chapter to 20 minutes. That's my goal. So this is India now, today. Notice, one big, huge, massive, unified country. Unified is the key word. Notice over here, though, Pakistan and Afghanistan. That's for your geography quiz that some of you are taking today. But in any case, so this is India, unified today. It wasn't always that way. As we studied at the very beginning, when we looked at Indian history, we learned that it did not have political unity, that it was only unified through its rituals of the Ganges and its religion and all these things. So the pilgrimage to the Ganges River and such. So India has never been one big unified state for a lot of reasons. Multiple religions, multiple, mostly Muslim and Hindu, and also multiple languages. So that's India today. How did it get there? How did it get unified? This is India in 1800. You can see that it's not unified at all. It's just a big, crazy quilt of different provinces and princely kingdoms and such. So I'm going to go through the understandings that are on the forum, on the wiki, and start presenting. So, as I told you on your rubric, I want you to start out with the big picture, and that's what this is. What is this chapter about? It tells you about the beginning, turning point, and effects of the turning point of Indian history from 1750 to, really, we're going to stop here around 1906, when Gandhi comes home to India. But that's for a later chapter, after World War II. Our later chapters after World War II, which is ends in 1945. So that's why that's there. So you'll see that India will not become this unified state independently until after World War II. We're stopping again in 1906. So 3 stages. The first stage is company rule. That is the British East India Company. You probably remember hearing about that in middle school or something. If not, you'll know about it now. So the British East India Company ruled India from 1750 to the middle 1800s. In the middle 1800s, there was an Indian revolt, and then afterwards, the British Raj took over. The British Raj means that the British government itself declared formal political control, basically claimed India as part of its empire. So the Raj is the Indian province of the British Empire. Okay, so they're now being ruled by Queen Victoria of England. She's the Empress of India. That's after the failed Indian Revolt of 1857. So that's the big picture. So first, let's talk about the impact that the British East India Company and industrialization and colonization had on 2 things: India's economy and India's culture. Now, first, let's start with a question. What is the British East India Company? During the Age of Exploration, when England was looking for resources and trade and colonies and all that sort of thing, this was the age of mercantilism. So at that point, free trade was not at all popular. Instead, mercantilism, you'll remember, where the government's, the country's goal was to export as much as possible, to import as little as possible, and to have more revenues, more money, more treasury than any other country. So because of that, England did not let free traders go out and trade freely. No, they created a monopoly. There's only one company, and Queen Elizabeth is the one who chartered it. She said this one company, the British East India Company, had the monopoly, complete 100% control over all British foreign trade in India and the Indian Ocean. So that's the British East India Company. So picture that as being a huge monopoly that if any trade is going on between England and Asia, it's this one company. It was a corporation. It sold stock to shareholders, and about 30 ships a year sailed from England to India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, here where we are, doing trade. So that's who the British East India Company is. you can see that our period here is 1750 to 1857. Remember our Industrial Revolution unit. It started, that little map drawing village exercise started exactly in the year 1750. So industrialization is going on in England during this time of company rule. And you remember by 1850 when we stopped, that's when railroads had covered all of England, and there's all the horrible pollution, all that sort of thing. So this is the time when England becomes that big industrial power. And they colonize India during this Industrial Revolution. So in the beginning, their colonies were only trading posts, Indian trading posts. Let me show you on this map. So in the early parts of company rule, India only set up little trading settlements in Calcutta, in Madras, in Calicut, and there's one more, I believe. Where's Bombay? Oh, and Bombay. Okay, so you just had 4 little trading posts that these business people set up, these traders set up, and that's how things started. But little by little, the rulers, the princes of these different little feudal states under the Mughal Empire, they started competing with each other, because the Mughal Empire, remember Akbar the Great, he was an earlier Mughal ruler, alive at the same time as Queen Victoria. So his empire had started breaking down in India, and so the feudal princes started competing with each other. And when they did that, they started asking the British to help them against their rivals. And so the British did. So little by little, the British started bringing in armies to help these rival princes in India to conquer each other and gain power, thinking that by doing that they would just have a bigger market, they would be on good terms with whatever princes ruled these areas. And it was all about expanding markets for British products, British textiles, shirts, whatever. So in the beginning, again, just a few little trading posts on the coast. That's all that India had. But as time went by and factories, steam-powered factories, the water frame, textile mills started being built in England, those factories to create shirts and clothes in England, as they started growing in power and number, the British started to restrict the Indian economy and not let them create, because the Indians were great textile merchants, great textile manufacturers. They had artisans who created great cotton and silk, and that was a hundreds of years long industry for them. So great textile artisans and merchants. But the British East India Company forbade them, did not allow them to create finished shirts. They would only allow them to farm the cotton and send that raw cotton back to England. And so this caused a really weird thing in England. It caused in India, it caused deindustrialization. The British East India Company is not letting the Indian merchants and artisans do their work because they only want the raw resources. You give us the cotton, we'll take it back to India. In our factories, we'll take it back to England. And in our factories, we will mass produce shirts, take them back to you in India, and we will sell them to you at a markup. So this caused a urban to rural migration. Once successful merchants and textile artisans and factory owners in India left the cities, went back to the countryside. They weren't farmers, but they had to learn how to farm, and there was not good farmland. So it actually sent India backwards in time. They also stopped trade, the Indian Ocean trade that India had been, Indian traders had been involved in for centuries. They stopped them from doing that because they wanted all trade to benefit England. So that's the effect economically. Culturally, the effect, as you can imagine, was that the Indians are seeing these incredibly technologically powerful and also culturally liberal Enlightenment types with their scientific, rational education, their political philosophy, all the stuff, the Enlightenment stuff, and their science, Newton and all that stuff. So they're very impressed and awed by these British, but at the same time, they despise them because they are creating poverty. So it created obviously a lot of confusion and conflict among the Indians themselves. How do we react to these Westerners? Now, I'm just going to back up for a second. Right now we're talking about the British East India Company, which is a company controlling India. This is a form of indirect control. The British government is not directly controlling India. All right. So when an imperial country just controls a country without direct control, it's called indirect control. So that's the first stage. So anyway, the British response. This man, Rammohun Roy, was an educated Indian who started studying European culture. He taught himself English and all that sort of thing, and he started the Bengal Renaissance. So he's one of the first to westernize, basically, to understand the ideas of liberal Enlightenment European thought and science, and to start arguing that the Indians should modernize but not lose their traditions. So they should sort of combine the best of traditional India and the best of European culture and economics and technology and science. British liberals at this time, in the first stage, before this revolt, the revolt's really important because things will change. So British liberals, just because you're a bourgeois, just because you're a businessman, doesn't mean that you're a racist, doesn't mean that you have a bad heart. So there were a lot of liberals who felt the same thing. Expats who were in India saying, we can help these Indians progress and enjoy the same benefits that we have of modern life, industrial life. So there was, on both sides, Indian and British, there were the desire to work well together. The problem is, a lot of these British liberals thought that for India to progress, it had to do it in British terms. And I'm going to read you just a little quote. An East India Company official declared that British education, for example, should create in India, quote, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, now get this, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. So, in other words, it doesn't matter what color what color their skin is. The important thing is if they are British on the inside, that's all that matters. So this is called cultural imperialism, where one culture thinks that its duty is to impose its culture on another. Rudyard Kipling, the guy who wrote the Jungle Book, which you probably saw in childhood, Rudyard Kipling. You remember the Jungle Book? Did you ever see it? He also wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden, which talks about cultural imperialism. The British progressives actually believing that they did have a superior culture and that it was their burden, a heavy, heavy pain, to carry it around the world and spread technology and science and capitalism to the world. Well, this didn't rub Rammohun Roy very well. He didn't understand why the British didn't get it. He is trying to meet the British halfway, and the British are saying, no, you have to meet us all the way. So there were some tensions here between the moderate Indians and the British liberals. The British liberals were ethnocentric. Ethnocentric, you should know the word. Ethno means my ethnic group, and centric means we're the center of the world, we're better. So this sort of ethnocentric cultural imperialism on the part of the British expats there. Now, the last thing is, you'll see this over and over again. Whenever explorers or colonizers come into any foreign country that's not Christian, the Christian missionaries will be right behind them because their goal, their mission is to evangelize, to convert other people. So, sure enough, they start flooding into India to turn them into Christians, and this starts making the Indians a little bit uncomfortable. I'm sorry, and I should say the Indians, both the Hindu and the Muslim, uncomfortable. They start not trusting these Europeans because now they're not just doing business, they're also doing religion. And so this started really causing some mistrust. And it all came to a head in 1750. I got to go down. I'm sorry, in 1857. And that's when we have our revolt. Let me just get all this stuff out of the way. That's when we have our revolt. Sepoys are are Indian soldiers who are hired by the British East India Company to protect its territory and the states that it controls. So the British in India hired Muslims and Hindu Indian soldiers to work for the British East India Company private army. They're mercenaries, they're Indians, they need a job. Well, a very strange event happened. The British came out with a new type of gun and a new type of cartridge, bullet in other words, for the gun, and in order for this bullet to work you had to bite it. The cartridge was made of paper and there was a little metal shell on the end, but inside there was a little barrier that separated two chemicals that would become explosive when they're combined. So you don't want to combine those chemicals until you're ready to shoot the cartridge. So you have to bite the cartridge in order for those two chemicals to combine. And then when you put it in the gun and the firing pin, when you pull the trigger, the firing pin hits the back of the cartridge, and with force it causes the explosion and it shoots the bullet out. Well, these cartridges also were oiled so that they would not get stuck inside the gun. And this way of biting cartridges was a new way. It was a new form of technology. So never before did the Indian soldiers have to bite their cartridges before putting in guns, and now they do, and they got this grease on them. And the rumor started spreading that the grease was animal fat, pig fat or cow fat, depending on who was spreading the rumor. And this caused a mutiny, believe it or not. Kind of like the guy in Tunisia who set himself on fire and caused the Arab revolts right now. This was really just the last straw. There was so much anger over these missionaries and over the deindustrialization and all sorts of stuff, the effects of now 100 years of British East India Company indirect rule, that the missionaries, the sepoy soldiers refused to bite the cartridges. We just won't bite them. And so they disobeyed orders from their British officers. British officers arrested some of them and put them in jail. You're disobeying orders. That's military discipline, right? So you go to jail. That's the way that works. And this caused anger, more anger from the sepoys. They rose up and they killed their officers, and then they went on this massive rampage across northern India. So this area here in dark blue, this was how all along the Ganges River soldiers rose up against their British colonial overlords, and the British had to squash this revolt from three sides, sending in all sorts of reinforcement and troops. So it was a massive, massive war. It got very dirty. The sepoys were murdering British women and children, expats' wives and children. The British strapped, as your textbook says, the British strapped Indian rebels to cannons in front of them and then shot the cannons, just ripping these British sepoys to shreds as they shot the cannons. So it was a really horrible, brutal war, this sepoy mutiny. It took a couple of years, but the British finally put it down, and in 1858 they declared the British Raj. So Queen Victoria becomes the Empress of India in 1857, and this begins the British Raj. Now, because of the brutality of the violence on both sides, the British start becoming social Darwinists. They start thinking that the Indians can't, after all, become British like those earlier British liberals argued, that they were racially inferior, these Indians. They were like all the other dark-skinned people. And so the British, understandably, after seeing their wives and children murdered by these angry Indians, who they are, after all, impoverishing and ruling unjustly, they start hating somewhat. At the same time, the Indians are becoming desperate for some way to unite against these people because they're obviously angry and more hateful too. But there are problems to Indian unity. They don't have anything to unite under as a single Indian identity. I'm Hindu, you're Muslim. We speak different languages. We come from different princely areas. Just so all of these divisions, and yeah, we could go back to the Mughal emperor, but even he is not particularly, it was weak at the end. So they don't have an easy way to unite. What does it mean to be Indian? The British, meanwhile, continue doing their industrial economic thing. They're building more and more railroads, and those railroads have some negative effects. It makes it easier for the British to move troops wherever they need to put down rebellions. It makes it easier for the British to continue stripping all of the resources from the Indians and exporting them to England faster and faster, all that sort of thing. But it has some unintended positive effects too, and some of them intended. Suddenly the Indians are able to send mail for a penny anywhere across India by rail really fast, so they can communicate faster. Now this is important because even though we don't have an identity to unite under too easily, now we can communicate quickly, and that's going to help us unite. They can also travel more easily themselves. A middle class starts emerging in India because they are working for the British Raj now. The British Raj makes a bureaucracy, just like Chincha Huangdi did for China way back when, right? A civil service, just like Augustus does. So, and in this bureaucracy, they're hiring educated, westernized Indians to work for the British Raj. Other ugly things are happening. Expatriate clubs. The British have the British Club, which only British can go to. So it's just like our clubs today, right? The American club is an expat club, except there were differences. In this, you could not be dark-skinned. You had to be white in order to be in this club. The only Indians allowed were servants. So even if you were a Western educated middle class Indian, you could not come into this club. So in other words, racism, social Darwinism is starting to pop up. So that's the segregation thing. Now, so how do the Indians react to this? You have attempts to unite into one nation, and Gopal Gokhale is our first example. He is kind of a Gandhi figure. He wanted not to have independence from England. He wanted to have self-rule. Okay, so Gokhale is our first guy. He wants self-rule. Oh, I need to put Tilak's name in here. So Gokhale says, no, we don't want independence. In fact, he's nonviolent. Self-rule means we are part of the empire, but the politicians governing it are Indian. Let us make our laws. Let us rule ourselves. Get your English governors out of here. In other words, treat us equal. Gokhale saw that British education, that enlightenment, equal rights, and all these sorts of things are good. He started criticizing some backwards things he thought of Indian tradition, like the caste system, like the untouchables, like child marriage laws. Girls could be married at 10 years old. He proposed this reform bill that he thought would make it more civilized. Let's make it 12 years old as the earliest a girl could marry. So he's a moderate. On the other hand, there was a radical named Tilak, and Tilak was revolutionary. He didn't want self-rule. He wanted independence. He disagreed with Gokhale then, and worse still, his attempt to unite the Indians was to use a lot of Hindu symbolism and to inspire people, motivate them. We're all Hindus, this sort of thing. Well, the Muslims are like, we're not Hindus. And so this started causing social divisions and conflict between the Indians themselves. So the colonized are having problems. The British said, see, you can't get along yourselves. You Hindus and you Muslims, you need us to be here to govern you, because you have never been able to govern yourselves. You always needed conquerors. The Mughal empires were conquerors. Muslims that came down. So you need outsiders to keep you from killing each other. So the Indians, though, said that this is just an example of the British divide and rule strategy. The British try to keep us divided Hindu against Muslim, whatever, because it keeps them in power. The British are aware that they have to persuade, get the support of the Indians. So they're saying, so we can rule better. We can give you good government. Well, it's good government that they promise. They've got the technology there. They've got the railroads, all this sort of thing. It comes to the test in 1896 and 1897. There is a massive drought. The monsoon rains don't come to India. And people start starving. There is no food. There is a famine. The British government was there. It had the ability to step in. There was surplus food stockpiled. All they had to do was distribute that food from whatever area had food, take it on your railroads and take it over to the areas that don't have food. So that's all they had to do. But because the British culture economically believed in free market capitalism, liberalism, let the market control itself, the government should not interfere, they didn't distribute this grain because they trusted the merchants and the market to work it out itself. And instead, what the merchants did when they saw that grain was in scarce supply, that drove the prices up. And when the prices went up, a lot of merchants started buying grain and then holding on to it, thinking that will make it more scarce. People are starving, yes, but if I buy this grain and hold on to it even more, then the price is going to go up and up and up. And so they did. They started stockpiling, and the result of that was 30 million people died. That's around the number of people that died in World War I, World War II. It's actually more than World War I, less than World War II. The British were there. They were promising good government, but because of their capitalistic free market faith, they failed the test. The free market didn't function well. So this is just, as you can see, the trend here is things get more and more and more tense. So England now starts turning to political theater, to propaganda. They start making big celebrations, like when there's a new king, they would have a ceremony, big massive ceremony with hundreds of elephants and parade and all sorts of things to crown the king, to honor the king's crowning in India and such. So they're trying to make the Indians proud to be part of the glorious British Empire, this sort of thing. And so this is the best they could do. Well, the glorious British Empire made a really stupid decision in 1905, and they partitioned Bengal. Bengal is up here, and by partitioning it, what they did was they created, so here's Bengal. They created a mostly Muslim state and a mostly Hindu state. They partitioned it, divided it by religious lines. And this seemed evidence and proof that England really was trying to divide and conquer, divide and rule, because now they're even making strong Muslim states. So this caused an explosion of anger, and the reaction was a boycott. And in this boycott, and this is where our story ends, it ends on a bad note. Indians make bonfires of the raw cloth that England is needing to export back to England to create shirts from. So the Indians themselves are in the streets, not burning themselves. They're burning British cloth as a symbolic, way of protesting. You need our cloth. You need us. We make you rich, and you are trying to divide us to rule us. So that is how that's how the story ends at this point. Let me see. Oh, I guess the last thing to say is that communities did start segregating. Like we see now, a lot of foreigners live in their little foreigner compounds. Well, this started happening in India towards the later part, after the Indian Revolt. And so relations between Indians and British are just getting worse and worse. In 1906, when that boycott happened, that is when Gandhi returns to India. And so the story of Gandhi will come up when we come back to India after World War II.